Hi, I'm Lucy Rathbone and I'm one of the clinical psychologists working for Lancashire's Emotional Health in Schools and Colleges service. As a service, we offer training and consultation about emotional wellbeing to educational professionals working throughout Lancashire. Through working with our colleagues in education, we have come to understand that students throughout the county are facing multiple barriers to achieving positive emotional wellbeing. This includes things like high levels of anxiety, which is what we'll be talking about in this video. We've also learned that there's often a shortage of support and information available to parents. So we've put together a series of videos with the aim of supporting parents to work alongside schools in improving children's emotional well-being. So as I mentioned, today's video is going to be about anxiety. So we'll start by thinking about what anxiety is. And in a nutshell, anxiety is an automatic response to things that we think are dangerous or threatening. So as such, it's very functional. It's there to serve a purpose to keep us safe. We see threats, we respond to them. It maximises our chance of survival. And because of that, it's a very normal, very valid experience, which does happen to all of us, regardless of culture or religion, all over the world. We have to have this capacity to feel anxiety because we need to be able to detect threats and respond to them in the name of maximising our own safety. And anxiety can affect us on multiple fronts. So it affects the thoughts that we're having, what goes through our mind. Am I safe? What was that noise? Can I cope with this? It affects the way we feel, if we're worried, afraid, scared, frightened, stressed. And if we're feeling those things, are we then sad, lonely, embarrassed? It affects our physiology. What is happening in our body? Is our heart pounding? Do our legs feel like jelly? And it also affects our behaviours, what we do, the choices that we feel able to make. How do we act in a way that responds to the threats that we think are around us and in a way that helps us to maximise our safety? So as such, we know anxiety is functional, it's adaptive, it's there to keep us safe, it's trying its best to do a good job. But we also know that if anxiety is around all the time, it can become very unpleasant to experience and actually even become quite problematic. So we've already touched now on where anxiety comes from, and we want to really highlight this sense that it's an evolutionary functional purpose. It allows us to detect and respond to threats. So if you think about our earliest ancestors, they will have needed really, really good threat detection systems and ways of keeping themselves safe and surviving. So we sometimes refer to this as survival of the fittest. Those early ancestors that were really good at detecting threat and really good at responding to threats effectively are more likely to have survived and passed on those skills to future generations. As such, over the many years this has been going on for, our brains are becoming more and more hardwired to be these fantastic threat detection survival machines. Great. However, the kind of threats that were around when these brains first started taking shape are actually very different to the ones we tend to face now in the modern age. So that means our tried and tested safety responses are not always as effective as we would like them to be in the context of the threats we see around us at the moment. So the threat response needed for a pack of hungry wolves back in the day might be quite different to what we need now to overcome nerves associated with something like public speaking. But we've got this same hardwired hardware, so to speak, to try and overcome threats, regardless of what the nature of them is. So if we think very simply about anxiety in the brain, we can say that we've got an old brain at the back of the head and a new brain at the front. The old brain is where our alarm system lives. It's our survival centre. So feelings like fear, anxiety, they live back there. This is where we experience them. At the new brain, at the front of the brain, we've got much more advanced, kind of sophisticated thinking skills, things like planning, problem solving, decision making. they're all in the new brain. But interestingly, whilst emotions like anger or fear or anxiety sit in the old brain, the ability to regulate and control those emotions and the urges and impulses that often come with them sit at the front of the brain. So with that in mind, we can understand why it can be so difficult to concentrate when we are feeling anxious, because in times of anxiety, it's the old brain, the threat system, our alarm centre, that takes the driving seat, starts calling the shots, and it has control over the choices available to us. Survival and safety trumps everything. So if we think we're in some sort of perceived danger, it's the old brain that's in control and calling the shots and taking the lead role, which means we have less access to those frontal thinking skills like problem solving, decision making, emotional regulation, all those skills that will be really handy to have around in times of crisis and panic, much less available. Old brain is in charge and its focus is safety, safety, safety. And that response, that threat response, we often refer to as the fight or flight response, and can include this freeze response as well. So in times of danger, the old brain at the back of the head decides, I need to keep you safe, and the best way to do that is my tried and tested mechanism of either fighting whatever it is that's scaring me, becoming aggressive, defending myself, protecting myself physically, or by flighting, so running away, escaping, getting myself out of this anxiety-provoking situation. If those two fail, then I'm left with the freeze response. I'm just going to play dead and hope for the best. It's my last resort, but if running and fighting don't work, that's what I'm left with. So this is the kind of old school, developed over many, many years, a response that we usually have access to in times of heightened perceived distress and threat. And as we've already mentioned, this serves a good function and it's kept us alive as a species for a long, long time, but it can be lacking in some aspects in the 21st century. So as we've already mentioned, anxiety can affect us in multiple ways, and one of those ways is the effect it has on our bodies, our physiology. So when anxiety or fear are triggered in the brain, the body responds to deal with the threat. And like we've said, we've got this fixed, well-evolved sense that more energy equals more safety, because energy means we can fight or we can run. The answer, according to our brain, seems to be more energy. If I'm anxious, if I'm scared, if I've detected a threat, I need more energy. That's the answer to everything. So our body begins this process of creating more energy. It releases hormones like adrenaline, which gets our heart pumping and our lungs breathing faster, getting those oxygens to our muscles. So just take a minute and think about what you notice when you're feeling anxious. What is that bodily response that you might recognise when you're feeling nervous, scared, afraid or worried about something? A lot of people will recognise the heart rate increases. Some people will notice that they start breathing more quickly. As a byproduct of that, lots of energy in our muscles, we might start to tremble. The blood's being diverted away from things like digestion, not a priority at the moment, so we might get a bit of a tummy ache. If we're breathing really quickly, trying to get oxygen to those muscles, sometimes we might feel a bit lightheaded, might have a headache. All these things are part of the fight and flight response, and it often explains why younger children tend to report emotional feelings like anxiety in terms of physical ailments and complaints like headaches, tummy aches, feeling sick, butterflies in the tummy, not feeling right. So yeah, just take a minute and think about how you notice those physical signs of anxiety in your body, but also maybe how your child reports anxiety, and if they often notice that anxiety comes along with these bodily reactions. As mentioned, anxiety also affects the way that we think. So when we're feeling very anxious, when something around us doesn't feel safe, we might notice our thoughts becoming slightly more negative. Our brain's response is kind of like, I'd rather assume the worst because that's most likely to keep me safe. prepare for the worst, hopefully be okay. So our brain and our thinking processes can drift towards this sense of what's the worst that could happen. But what we know is if we're always thinking about what the worst thing that could happen is, if we're always expecting or anticipating a disaster or a nightmare or a catastrophe, then that will create more anxiety and we can get stuck in this loop of feeling worse and worse and worse. Again, it's trying to be functional. It's trying to say, well, let's just plan for the worst because then I can keep myself extra safe. But it can be really exhausting to constantly be worrying about the worst thing that can happen. And as we know, the worst thing that can happen isn't necessarily the most likely thing that can happen. So we sometimes put anxious thinking styles into kind of broad categories, and it can be really helpful in helping us to spot when our brains drifted towards this anxious, very negative, very risk-focused pattern of thinking. Like I said, it means well, but can be very exhausting and unpleasant to be trapped in this kind of negative focus. So one of those categories is all or nothing thinking. We lose the ability to be balanced and to be reasonable and rational. And we might have thoughts like, well, I got one bad mark in that test, so I'm a failure. That piece of coursework wasn't the mark I wanted, so all my coursework is basically rubbish. We might fall into the trap of self-blaming. My team lost the game and I know it's all my fault. We might start trying to fortune tell, as in predicting the future. I know no one's going to sit with me on this school trip. I know I'm going to fail that test. Everyone's definitely going to laugh at me. It's all going to go wrong. Sometimes we'll start catastrophizing. So we're not only making a negative prediction about the future, but we're expecting the absolute worst is going to happen. So it might be, I'll never make friends with her ever, ever, ever again. No one's going to talk to me. I probably won't even be able to speak to anyone in my class. And then I won't want to go to school and I'll be stressed. And what if I start crying and then people start picking on me? And if I drop out of school, I can't get my GCSEs. And then where am I going to work? We can go down a really dark hole quite quickly if we don't spot that catastrophizing thinking trap. Mind reading, similar to fortune telling, we're making guesses about things we don't actually know, and as such they tend to be negative. So the teacher thinks my work is rubbish. They think I'm weird and don't want to be friends with me. She didn't wave at me just now because she's fallen out with me. We're making predictions, negative predictions about what people think, and often they're based on this negative, anxious thinking style rather than kind of facts and evidence. We might also start disqualifying the positives. So even when something good does happen, we're so used to this kind of negative, risk-averse thinking style that we can't really listen to it. Yeah, I know I did well in that test, but it was only luck. So they're the kind of thoughts, the patterns of thinking that we need to look out for when feeling anxious, because again, although they mean well, they can become really unhelpful. We also, on top of bodily sensation, on top of the way our brain starts thinking, of course, anxiety affects the way we feel. So the big one is that we feel anxious, which means we feel scared, afraid or worried. It can also feel quite stressful. But then when we're feeling like that, we can also feel really sad. We can feel really angry again. We know anxiety leads to that fight or flight response. Fight requires a decent level of kind of aggression and anger and frustration. It can be very confusing feeling worried all the time. You can start really second guessing yourself. And also a big one is it can feel exhausting. Living with anxiety can be very draining and relentless. And finally, we know that feeling anxious can affect our behaviours. Our body feels ready to run. We've got all this adrenaline, all this energy coursing through our bodies. It can make us really want to get out of there or to become quite defensive, to become quite aggressive. This is millions of years of evolution trying to keep us safe. It can drive that need to escape, to get away from whatever it is that feels so scary. Understandable. but this means we can become avoidant of anything that triggers that anxious response. And whilst avoidance is such a common strategy for coping with things that feel scary, and whilst it can be quite helpful in the short term, and yeah, we did manage to avoid that party that was making us feel really stressed, it only maintains anxious responses in the long term. So next time that party invitation arrives, all those anxious feelings and more are going to come flooding back. We can sometimes gravitate towards people or places that make us feel safe to avoid feelings of anxiety. Again, understandable, but again, whilst it might help a bit in the short term and alleviate anxiety immediately, in the long term, it's not solving that problem. It's not breaking that connection our brain has made between a certain person or place and this feeling of threat. And we can also find ourselves trying to avoid feelings like feeling ashamed or embarrassed or self-critical. And again, we can withdraw from situations that, hey, might not have been as bad as we were expecting. So we've thought about what anxiety is, where it comes from, and how it affects us on multiple levels. Now we're going to think a little bit about what could trigger anxiety, and this is different for everybody, but some general things to be mindful of when trying to unpick anxiety is things like life in general, the things that are going on a day-to-day basis for your child, maybe at school, maybe with friends, maybe with hobbies. Big ones tend to be things like transitions or exams. Things like friendship issues can cause a lot of distress and anxiety. And if we think back to the way that this brain has evolved to keep us safe, we know that being in the in-group, being socially accepted, feels really safe. And the thought of being not in the in-group, being left out or being rejected is really, really anxiety provoking, because we feel so much safer and so much more equipped to survive when we've got a good social network around us. And we see more and more, don't we, young people comparing themselves to other people, being really keen to fit in, and it makes sense. We get it. We know why that feels so crucial. Anything that makes someone feel unsafe is going to be a trigger. That could be something very, physical, in terms of physical safety. For example, having to get on a bus that's driving really fast every morning, or it could be something that's more of a feeling of threat. So something like I've got to do a presentation, and the threat, the unsafe feeling there might be coming from a sense of potential social rejection. Changes, transitions, often big triggers of anxiety. So maybe again, just take a second and think about if your child has or is feeling anxious at the moment, what could be triggering it? What could be going on for your child? And why might that be feeding into this sense of unsafety? Now, it's really hard to think about current triggers of anxiety without taking a moment to pause and just consider the ongoing impact that the pandemic, the COVID-19 outbreak and virus has had on all of us. It's created a lot of change. It's created this huge sense of unsafety in terms of physical wellness across our communities. It's interrupted people's routines. It's got in the way of people being able to engage in protective factors that might have helped to manage anxieties in the past, like being able to go horse riding or being able to talk to that mentor at school. It's had a big, big impact, and there might be children out there who have coped and managed for so long, but it's only now that we're seeing this sense of anxiety that might be a bit of a hangover from the last couple of years. So please bear that in mind when you're trying to make sense of any anxiety that you've spotted. The last 2 years have been huge, and I don't think we're really close yet to understanding the true extent of the impact that the pandemic has had on all of us, including our children. So it's really important to think about triggers, what's creating this anxiety. It's also really useful if we can spot signs of anxiety. What does anxiety look like in young children, in our children, in ourselves? So again, I'd invite you to maybe even pause and just think, how do I know if my child is anxious? What are the first signs that I tend to spot? So in young children, it might be things like finding it hard to separate from their parents, wanting to be closer to you, or they might see that same closeness seeking behaviour in school, maybe with a favourite TA or a favourite teacher or a dinner lady. They might find it really hard to start new things, get down and do their homework or finish things. Maintaining concentration and attention is really difficult if that old brain is trying to convince you that you need to be scanning for threat all the time because something's not feeling safe. We might notice struggles with friendships. Again, really hard to be relaxed and enjoy social company if you're on edge and you're feeling stressed. They might be exhibiting signs of having overwhelming feelings. They might be very tearful. They might be very tense. They might have real difficulty settling. If you're in threat mode, you're not relaxed. Think about that physical side of anxiety. It's not possible to be calm, relaxed, chilling, and anxious at the same time. They're two very different body systems. So if your child can't sit still anymore all of a sudden, they're wandering around, they can't get through a film, they're really struggling to get to sleep at night, maybe that's a signal that anxiety is increasing for them at the moment. We've already mentioned some children will communicate anxiety in terms of the changes they've noticed in their body. I feel sick, I've got a headache. And sometimes that pairs with wanting to stay closer to you. I can't go to school, I feel really sick. They might be struggling to cope with changes and transitions. It's very difficult to manage big, scary things if our brain's convincing us they're going to be disastrous. And there will be many, many more. So again, it might be worth taking a moment, pause the video and think, yeah, what do I notice in my child? So we've talked about what anxiety is, where it's come from, the way it affects us, things that can trigger it, and ways we can spot when anxiety is on the scene. We're now going to have a think about 5 very broad key principles that can help us supporting our child when we've noticed that they might be struggling with high levels of anxiety. So I'm going to talk through each one of these in turn. So number 1 is to understand and normalize anxiety. So by this we mean really trying to understand their world, their perspective. Thinking maybe with a friend or a partner or with the child themselves about what has been going on for them recently. How have they made sense of that? How have they perceived it? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? Anything that could have led them to this experience, what might be contributing to their level of anxiety. And there's a diagram here, just a little cartoon that shows an iceberg. And what we see and what the child might be able to communicate verbally might just be the tip of what's going on. We want to get really curious, really think about what's going on, really break it down so we can understand it, get to the bottom of it. And as we do that, it's often beneficial to normalize it. Yeah, of course you're feeling anxious. I didn't realise you were going around thinking that you're definitely going to fail this test and then that you wouldn't get into college next year. If you're thinking that, of course you're going to feel really stressed out. So normalising and understanding the anxiety is often the first step towards trying to help with that. We would also really encourage you to try and find some time and create a bit of a protective space to really listen to the feelings and the fears of the young person. Try to really hear them and sit with them. And as a parent or a professional or a teacher, it can be really hard to sit with a child's distress because that's the last thing we want from them. We want to rescue them. We want to make it all feel better. Whatever the worry is, we want to take it away. But sometimes it can be really useful before we do all that to just sit with it, really validate it, hear them out, give it full attention, keep eye contact, and really hash out what is going on here, how are you feeling, what is that like? So if a child says, I just think I'm going to fail this exam, our initial instinct might be to say, you're not going to fail the exam, you're brilliant, you've tried really hard, you've done all your revision, you're going to be fantastic. And all those messages are often very comforting to hear. But before we do all that, can we create space to just validate and normalize how they're feeling, really listen and connect with their experience of their anxiety? Just a moment to say, gosh, that's a big worry to have. No wonder you've been feeling so stressed. It sounds like you've got it in your head that this is going to go badly. And I know that's not what you want. Whew, it's a lot to be holding on to, isn't it? If we can create that time to really listen, really connect with the emotion, that can be really, really valuable. So thirdly, and I suppose my initial thought when reading this is that it's possibly easier said than done, especially when there's lots of stress and threat and anxiety around. But we want as much as possible for a child who's feeling anxious, maybe at school or within friendships, we want them to have a safe base somewhere. We want somewhere that they can retreat to and feel really secure and really safe. So the diagram here shows a model called the circle of security. And it's the idea that the parent, the secure base, those pair of hands on the left of the image, they're that kind of source of security that's not going anywhere. And from that, if you feel that in the world there is this safe haven that you can always retreat to in times of stress, we know children are more likely to be able to explore, go into the scary world, experience new things because they've got that safety knowing that if anything gets too tough, I know I've got this safe haven to come back to. So anything you can do to create that sense of safety for a child, to make sure they know, you know what, it's okay to try that new thing. It's okay to manage that change because I got you, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. That can be very strengthening. I sometimes think of it as like a bit of a coat of armour. You know, I don't need to avoid things. I don't need to stay by your side because I know you're not going anywhere. I can go and do these brave and scary things, safe in the knowledge that you're there to catch me if anything wobbles. Next, we think about coping strategies. And it's really useful to be able to model these, not just tell them, not just advise them, not just suggest them, but model them at home. And by modeling, we mean we want your child to be able to see you managing anxiety and learn from you and learn all your brilliant ways of how you do deal with anxiety. And this is really good for two reasons, really. First, it's teaching you skills, but second, it's teaching that, yeah, we all get anxiety. Anxiety is not something to be scared of or terrified of. It's not something to be ashamed of. I get it too, but it's okay because we can deal with it. So have a really good think now about how you cope with your own anxieties. Do you talk to a friend or a partner? Do you do some relaxation or meditation? Do you exercise? What is it that you do that helps you manage the day-to-day stresses and anxieties that unfortunately come along with life? And allow your child to see you doing that. Allow them to join in, because through that modelling, they will learn to develop skills of their own. It can be different for everybody what helps, but have a think what works for you and how could you allow your child to witness that and learn that anxiety is part of life that we can all deal with rather than something that's going to be completely overwhelming. Finally, I just invite you all to just have a think about labels. So sometimes, as I said, as parents, as professionals, we really want to help our child. We really want to save them from any distress. And sometimes we look for the answers in terms of psychological diagnoses. And we get into this framework of thinking of what's the problem here, you know, something is wrong, we need to diagnose it, we need to label it, we need to fix it because I don't want my child to be in any distress. And that is an option, and for some people it's the best option. But I would invite you to have a little think about how labels can sometimes become less helpful. Because if we label a child as having an anxiety disorder, or they can't sit still because they've got, you know, some sort of neurological difference rather than the fact that actually they're just having a really stressful moment, that can sometimes become quite defining, and then that can really reinforce a child to underestimate their ability to cope with things. So whilst there can be a real time and place and value in thinking about diagnosing difficulties, we also want to make sure we consider that actually being able to sit with your child and build a joined up understanding of what's going on and why, making sense of that and recognising, yeah, that's why anxiety comes along just for reasons like this, but we can get through it together, then sometimes that can be slightly more helpful and open up more ideas for solutions and strategies than it can be to kind of jump in towards labelling the anxiety as a problem or a pathology, which often it's not. Often it's a very human reaction to a stressful life event. So to summarise, anxiety is a normal human experience and it is our brain's way of keeping us safe. It affects our physiology, it affects the way we think, it affects our emotions and how we feel, and ultimately it affects what we do. It's not our fault, it's not something to be criticised, it's a normal and common reaction to stressful life events, which we all, unfortunately, are going to be exposed to. Although it is normal, it can be really unpleasant, it can be tiring, it can be stressful, it can also feel embarrassing. But we can listen, we can normalise fears, we can try and work together to understand it, and we can model positive ways of coping. Thank you very, very much for listening to this video. I hope it has been of some help. If you've listened to this and you think we need some more support for my child and their anxiety, you might wish to speak to a teacher or a SENCO at their school. You could also consider speaking to your GP and seeing what access to other services might be available. And you could also think about looking at other organisations that may be able to help. So there's a link in this slide to the Healthy Young Minds website, which has lots of resources that you can have a think about. Thank you very much for listening. Wish you all the best. Take care. Bye.